Just as the neighborhood was settling into its usual quiet rhythm, the calm shattered with a thunderous engine roar that sent birds fleeing from the trees. A candy apple red Lamborghini Aventador, exhaust howling like a dragon armed with a megaphone, screeched to a showy stop directly across from my driveway gate. I stood frozen, toothbrush dangling from my mouth, staring out my bedroom window in disbelief. The driver, an impeccably styled platinum blonde woman dressed in flashy workout clothes and a neon pink windbreaker, stepped out confidently. Without so much as a glance toward my gate, she unfurled a yoga mat directly on my portion of the sidewalk. Then, with practiced flair, she propped up her phone at just the right angle and announced loudly enough for the whole block to hear, "Welcome back to Mindset with Karen. Today we're taking up space emotionally, physically, and yes, that means parking wherever we want." I nearly choked on my toothpaste. "My name's Darren." Quiet type, former military engineer. I live on the far edge of a quiet suburban neighborhood, technically just outside the official boundaries of the HOA. Or at least, I used to be outside of it. I like peace, engines, and being left alone, which is exactly why Karen's recent campaign to extend her self-appointed authority into my world has been pure torture. But this morning was something new. I had an important interview, a huge opportunity I'd been prepping for weeks. It was with Atlas Defense Systems, a national security contractor where discipline, order, and punctuality matter. I had exactly enough time to make ITA until Karen turned my exit into her personal landing strip. I yanked on jeans and a clean shirt, grabbed my briefcase, and headed out. The moment my shoes hit the gravel, Karen turned to greet me with a smile so fake it belonged in a museum exhibit. "Morning, Darren." Loving the flannel, very country chic. I halted just short of her Lamborghini's side mirror. "You're blocking my driveway. I have somewhere I need to be." She stretched into a yoga pose like she hadn't heard a word. "HOA guidelines say shared access lanes aren't considered private property during community hours." I blinked. "Community hours? That's not a thing." With a shrug, she replied, "It is now." "Voted on it last Thursday." "By who?" "You and your cat." She gasped dramatically. "Wow, that's incredibly rude. Mr. Whiskers happens to be our treasurer." I could feel a vein pulsing in my temple. I knew better than to push her. The problem with Karen wasn't that she didn't understand boundaries, it's that she understood them exactly and redrew them around herself like a monarch expanding her empire. Just last week, she had new signs installed at the neighborhood entrance. "Karen's cul-de-sac, HOA President for life." Some neighbors thought it was satire. I knew better, and now, her six-figure ego mobile was sitting in my path on purpose. I gave her one final warning. "Karen, move the car, now, or I'll find another way out." She squinted over her green smoothie and asked in a syrupy tone, "Is that a threat?" I smiled back, calm and steady. "Not yet." Back inside, I dialed the local non-emergency number. The dispatcher explained that because the car wasn't technically abandoned and I lived right at the HOA's perimeter, it could take several hours to respond. Several hours. That's when it hit me, that familiar itch from my military days. The one that kicks in when logic fails and the only option left is creative problem solving. I glanced toward the barn. Not just any barn. That's where I kept my restored equipment, old projects, and vintage hardware, including one fully functional, street legal, yes, I double-checked, M60 patent tank. Retired, yes, but entirely capable of navigating rugged terrain. I wasn't ready to use it. Not yet. By the time the morning passed, I'd already missed my interview. My call went to voicemail. I stood behind the gate, watching Karen and her yoga clique pack up their mats, still giggling, acting like this was all part of some harmless neighborhood prank. One of them pointed at my house and whispered something behind oversized sunglasses. Karen laughed, grabbed her phone again, and hit record. Today's lesson is about boundaries and how some people need to learn to share the view. That was the breaking point. I turned around and walked back inside before I did something I'd regret. My hands trembled, and not from rage, but that raw frustration of having your control taken away. The kind of helplessness I thought I left behind when I left the battlefield. Back then, we had protocol, chain of command, swift decisions. Out here, it's red tape, fake rules, and a Lamborghini with a license plate that says Karen. Later that day, I found something taped to my fence post, a laminated notice inside a glittery pink envelope. The HOA was officially notifying me, Darren Milra, of potential violations, including unauthorized gate structures, visual clutter, and non-compliance with community spirit. It had Karen's signature at the bottom, in purple gel ink with a tiny heart next to her name. At the bottom, in bold, "Consider this a friendly warning before formal action." Formal action? Against me? I checked the HOA charter again. I never even signed it. But there it was, an updated clause. Turns out the community zone had just been reclassified. A newly filed map had been submitted to the county, and it looked like someone had spilled red wine across a blueprint. Only this wasn't a spill, it was intentional. A bold red line now looped awkwardly around my property. Karen had taken it upon herself to expand her empire with the confidence of a kid drawing borders in Crayona, and dared anyone to challenge her. I wasn't going to let it slide. The next morning, I drove straight to the county office. At the front desk sat a tired-looking clerk, cradling a giant coffee mug that read, "Keep calm and stamp forms." I explained my situation. She typed, paused, squinted at the screen, then leaned forward. "It says here the submission came from a Karen Blakely. She filed it as part of a temporary land annexation request." I raised an eyebrow. "Those aren't approved overnight, normally." "No," she said, frowning, "but this one was fast-tracked. There's a handwritten note attached. It says AC approval. Boot to broken bar. There's no actual attachment." That wasn't just strange. It reeked of something more. Backdoor filings, backyard legal maneuvers, and now, official-looking warnings in glitter-covered envelopes. Karen wasn't just a nosy neighbor with too much time. She was running a full-fledged HOA regime, unchecked and absolutely unchecked. Unless someone stood up to her, she'd roll over everyone in her way. That evening, I walked into the barn. The tank sat quietly in the center of the space, still and solid, like a monument from another era. But to me, it didn't look old, it looked ready. And for the first time in weeks, so was I. Karen wanted a kingdom. She was about to discover that not all castles come with moats. Some come with armor plating and 105mm main guns. The next morning, an eerie stillness had settled over the cul-de-sac. Even the air felt like it was waiting for something. Karen's Lamborghini was gone, but in its place was something even more obnoxious. A brand new wooden signpost planted right at the edge of my yard. It hadn't been there the day before. Coffee in hand, I stepped outside and squinted at the lettering. HOA Expansion Zone, a future development site under consideration. I nearly dropped the mug. She wasn't just redrawing boundaries on paper now, she was hammering physical stakes into the ground like she was winning a round of real-life Monopoly. I ripped the sign out by the bazzy roots and ala and tossed it onto the curb. Before I could make it back to my porch, Karen materialized like a storm cloud, flanked by two men in khakis and tucked-in polos. One wore a badge, Community Officer Trenton. The other, a sour-looking man with a comb-over and oversized sunglasses, didn't say a word, just nodded silently, like he was there to document my existence. Karen wasted no time. "Well, that's destruction of HOA property." Bold move, daring especially for someone with 2 pending citations. I looked over at the clipboard guys, who seemed ready to measure every blade of grass on my lawn. I took a slow step forward, just enough to make Karen instinctively shift back. "This isn't whole land. My deed is older than whatever power grab you scribbled on that map. Until a court says otherwise, that sign belongs in the trash." Trenton cleared his throat, suddenly less confident. We were just told to verify easement lines, nothing confrontational." Karen rolled her eyes and snapped, "Oh, grow a spine, Trent." He shuffled back half a step. The other man began snapping pictures of my property like he was photographing wildlife on safari. I checked the county site again. Her map was still active. That red border still looped my house like a noose. I wasn't going to wait for red tape to slowly strangle me. I needed someone else who dealt with her madness. That's when I thought of Mitch. Quiet guy, lived a couple streets over. He once told me Karen wrote him up for placing the garden gnome too close to the HOA's visual perimeter. I found him trimming hedges, his face unreadable. The moment I mentioned the map, he let out a dry laugh. She did the same thing to the Jacksons, claimed their koi pond was a safety hazard and filled it with cement. People thought she was bluffing a broken bar until the next HOA newsletter announced a new dog park, They moved out 2 months later. I asked if anyone had ever tried to fight back. He paused. Maybe 2 years ago. Some guy named Phil went after her, accused her of misusing HOA funds, posted about it online. And, next day, his fence was declared culturally offensive, and she called animal control on his cat. Haven't seen him since. That's when it all clicked. Karen didn't just love control as she weaponized it. She turned petty regulations into traps, citations into threats. She didn't want a peaceful neighborhood. She wanted obedience. When I got home, there was another letter shoved into my mailbox, printed on expensive cardstock. It even had a faint lavender scent. Notice of emergency inspection. The HOA community preservation team would be conducting a fire safety evaluation of my property. Scheduled time, 4 p.m. I looked at the clock. It was 3:52. They had planned this. I sprinted to the barn and flung both doors open wide. Sunlight spilled across the tank's gleaming surface, a clean, restored, and as intimidating as ever. I'd always kept it hidden. Not anymore. Right on cue, Karen pulled up, her loyal minions in tow. This time, a tall man in an official vest stepped out alongside the HOA fire risk evaluator printed across the back. He wore dark sunglasses and carried a clipboard like it was the gavel of a judge. Karen beamed like she was the host of a home makeover show. Darren, we just need to make sure the so-called fire risk evaluator took one step into the barn, paused, and locked eyes on the tank. He looked like he just discovered a mythical beast sleeping in a garage. Is that real? He asked. I gave a simple nod. Restored M60. Street legal. Registered under a state historic preservation program. He blinked slowly, clearly impressed. That's insanely cool. Karen's face twitched like she'd just tasted something sour. She jumped in immediately. It's not approved by the HOA. It's noisy. It's disruptive. Trenton, now standing meekly behind her again, chimed in. He didn't file a parking variance for a vehicle of that size. I handed the evaluator a folder. Inside was everything: a registration with the state's historic military equipment list, insurance documentation, legal compliance records, even a signed letter from a congressman who had once posed with the tank during Veterans Month. The evaluator flipped through the papers in silence. Karen hovered nearby, buzzing with irritation, trying to suck some authority from the situation. Finally, he closed the folder and looked up. Legally, he's not only allowed to have IDA, he's protected. Section 18B of the zoning code. Clear as day. Karen's face froze like she'd just been unplugged from the simulation. You're telling me he can just keep a tank? I folded my arms. It's not just a tank, Karen. It's a preserved piece of military history. The little HOA squad backed away awkwardly. Karen lingered, silent now. She didn't shout or protest. She just stared at the tank, expression tight, eyes calculating. I knew that look. She wasn't defeated. She was plotting her next move. Later that evening, I did a walk around my yard and something new caught my eye. Mounted high in a tree just outside my property line was a small camera. It was pointed directly at my barn. It hadn't been there last week. A closer look, aided by binoculars, revealed everything. Karen had installed it herself, disguised as part of a birdwatching project she announced in the community newsletter 2 days ago. That's when it all clicked. She was collecting evidence, building a narrative, one she could take to officials or the media, painting me as a risk. The tank wasn't a legal issue anymore, so she'd pivoted. Now it was all about optics. Make me look unstable, dangerous, a threat to the neighborhood. I couldn't let that stick, so I changed tactics. Instead of hiding the tank, I put it on display. I posted restoration updates in local forums. I invited veterans and military history buffs to visit on weekends. I even teamed up with a shop teacher at the nearby high school to offer walkthroughs to students curious about the mechanics behind it. The story was no longer hers to tell, it was mine. The next day, Karen showed up again in the Lamborghini, though this time she parked just to the side of my driveway, close enough to make a point, but technically not blocking it. Classic Karen, passive-aggressive with a smug smile. She got out, looked at the tank, then at me. This isn't over, Darren. I took a sip of coffee. I know, that's what makes it fun. She turned on her heel and marched away in a cloud of perfume and manufactured indignation, but I could feel she had something else planned. something louder, and this time, I'd be ready, because when someone tries to turn your land into their personal playground, sometimes the only thing that speaks loud enough to a broken bar is 52 tons of tractor resolve that couldn't care less about exotic sports cars. The air that morning felt heavy, charged with a kind of stillness that signals a storm, not one with rain or thunder, but something far more personal. Birds were quiet, neighbors peeked out from behind blinds but didn't step onto their porches. Something was off. I spotted an envelope taped to my garage door. No glitter, no pink ink, just a plain, official-looking notice bearing the gold HOA seal. I opened it, expecting the usual nonsensey, maybe a warning about my hedge height or another bogus citation, but this one was different. An official summons to attend a conflict resolution hearing at the community clubhouse. 2 days from now. The listed charges: displaying threatening military hardware, disturbing neighborhood mental peace, and a most baffling of all excessive patriotic display. I reread that last part multiple times, convinced it had to be a joke. At the bottom were 2 signatures. One, unsurprisingly, belonged to Karen. The other, a man named Brock Hensley, listed as the HOA's acting legal representative. The name was vaguely familiar, so I did a quick search. Sure enough, I found a photo, Brock, holding a martini and posing poolside next to Karen at some kind of home mixer. Not only was he not a licensed attorney, he wasn't even a paralegal. He was Karen's third cousin who once completed a 2-week online legal seminar, and now he was heading up her version of a courtroom. I wasn't going to let that stand, but I also wasn't going to ignore it. I got back in my truck and drove down to the county building again, this time bypassing the front desk and heading straight to the supervisor's office. His name was Harris, a stone-faced man who looked like he hadn't smiled since the days of dial-up internet. I laid it all out: property lines, fake zoning maps, Lamborghini blockades, and yes, the tank. He remained unmoved until I mentioned the HOA hearing. That got a reaction. They scheduled a conflict resolution hearing against you, a broken bar, without verifying you're even part of the HOA? I nodded. He tapped a few keys. Harris tapped away on his keyboard for a moment, then leaned back in his chair. That's illegal, he said flatly. They can't enforce HOA rules on a property that opted out, especially one that predates the HOA charter. Your home is legally exempt. If they go through with this hearing, it'll blow up in their faces. It was the first solid win I'd had in days. Still, I knew better than to think Karen would be stopped by logic or laws. She didn't play by the rules. She rewrote them. So I prepared. That night, I went over every inch of the tank. I reinforced the treads, double-checked the engine, and ran full system diagnostics. This wasn't about intimidation. It was about standing ground, because people like Karen only yield when the wall they're trying to push won't move. The next morning, something strange showed up in my mailbox. A glossy flyer advertising an upcoming community showcase hosted by the HOA. Right at the center of the page was a new attraction: a driveway yoga returns, now with celebrity guests. And there she was, a Karina posing in full Zen mode right in front of my tank. The caption read, "Inner peace amongst iron giants." This wasn't just another yoga stunt, it was a full-on PR offensive. That evening, a delivery truck pulled up beside the barn. The driver handed me a clipboard. "One portable stage, audio equipment, and outdoor lights for setup," he said. Apparently, Karen had rented an entire event production setup using HOA funds without informing any actual residents. It was all dressed up as a feel-good wellness retreat, but I saw it for what it was. Another invasion dressed in pastel lycra. I declined the delivery. The truck rolled straight down to Karen's house instead, where she stood waving like a festival director in designer sunglasses. 2 more trucks arrived soon after, bringing tents, catering supplies, and for some reason, inflatable flamingos. But it didn't stop there. By the following morning, the HOA group chat, one I'd been forcibly added 2 weeks ago, was buzzing with photos of the setup and hashtags like #Zen and #MetalMeditation. My barn had been turned into a prop for Karen's brand. Even local influencers were posting things like, So excited to stretch next to that cool army thingy. It's like rustic meets retro. It was no longer just a battle over land, it was a battle over the narrative. Karen couldn't outlawyer me, she couldn't kick me out. So now she was trying to rebrand me, turn the tank into her personal set piece, use my identity to feed her curated, camera-ready image. But I wasn't going to be her accessory. I called Janelle at the county office again, asked her if there were any rules about home events being hosted near properties not under HOA jurisdiction. There's no restriction on hosting, she said, but nuisance laws do apply. If the event interferes with private life or poses a safety issue, it can be challenged. That was all I needed to hear. I spent the rest of the day turning my barn and yard into a message. Out front, I mounted a legal notice board that read, Federal Registry, Historic Military Equipment Zone, no unauthorized filming, no trespassing, live monitoring active. Then I installed a full perimeter of passive infrared sensors and not dangerous, just sensitive enough to trigger high-beam floodlights if someone wandered too close. That night, the lights flared and not twice. The first time, it was Karen's teenage nephew trying to climb on the tank for TikTok clout. The second, it was Karen herself pacing just outside the boundary, whispering into her phone. I couldn't make out the whole conversation, but one line came through loud and clear. Why is he not scared? He's supposed to be scared. She didn't get it. That wasn't fear. That was resolve. The day of the event arrived like the opening act of a circus. Cars packed the streets. Folding chairs were lined up in neat little rows just inches from my fence. Karen stood atop her portable stage, decked out in pastel activewear, smiling like she was about to host a spiritual TED Talk. There were influencers with drones, guys with gimbals, and people taking selfies next to my property like it was some quirky roadside attraction. Karen grabbed the mic and, in her most performative voice, said, "Let's all breathe in, and release the tension caused by unnecessary fear-mongering." The audience gave her a few polite chuckles. Then she gestured toward my barn. It's about coexisting with our Historia broken bar even if that history comes with dreads. That's when I flipped the switch. Inside the barn, the tank's engine thundered to life via loud, raw, unmistakable. The sound shattered the fake serenity like a sledgehammer to glass. Some of the guests stumbled back, a few shrieked. Karen froze mid-stretch. I slowly drove the tank out of the barn, bringing it to a halt just short of my property line. I didn't need to cross it. I didn't need to say a word. It sat there, idling, steel gleaming in the sun, calm, powerful, immovable. Then I stepped out, stood next to it, and crossed my arms. The cameras shifted, away from Karen, toward me. That influencer who'd called it retro cool earlier turned to her agent, whispered something, then packed up and left. The drone hovered for one last shot over the tank and buzzed off into the sky. Karen tried to wrest back control. "Let's remember," she said into the mic, "this is about peace, not provocation." But the crowd wasn't listening anymore. The illusion had shattered. She'd wanted a spectacle and now she had one, but it wasn't hers to control. By the afternoon, the crowd had thinned. Her carefully curated event had crumbled under the weight of its own absurdity. Karen stood alone on stage, glaring at me from behind her designer sunglasses. I gave her a small wave. She didn't yell, she didn't speak, she just turned and walked away, heels snapping against the platform. But I knew that walk, that wasn't surrender. That was the start of her next plan. Karen was clearly preparing for a counter-strike. What she didn't know was that mine was already underway. The days that followed were unnervingly quiet, like the stillness at the center of a storm. But I knew better than to enjoy it. Karen wasn't one to let a public flop like her yoga spectacle go unanswered. She'd tasted humiliation, and if there was one thing I understood about people like her, it's that they never take the blame. They find someone else to carry it. That someone was me. While the neighborhood settled back into routine, I was reinforcing mine. Every security camera on my property was tested, updated, and linked to a secure off-site backup. I rechecked the tank's GPS system, inspected tread pressure, and went through the barn like a general prepping for the next battle. Though the war was more about paperwork and social sabotage than actual firepower, I wasn't worried about Karen trying something physical. Her weapons were bureaucracy, theatrics, and weaponized gossip, and she wielded them with surgical precision. Right on cue, another bogus letter appeared in my mailbox, this one styled like an official HOA document but sourced from a subcommittee that didn't exist in any charter or bylaw. According to the letter, I was being evaluated for creating an environment of psychological unease. The tank was described as a military-grade intimidation fixture and cited as a threat to neighborhood walkability and emotional tranquility. It would have been hilarious if it hadn't come with a blurry nighttime photo of the tank, complete with Karen's unmistakable handwriting scribbled over it. She'd drawn arrows pointing at things like unlabeled switches and unauthorized reflective surfaces, underlining words dramatically and looping her Ks like she was writing a middle school ransom note. It wasn't just an HOA complaint, she had taken it to the county safety board. 2 days later, a pair of county officials arrived at my door. They wore blue windbreakers and the cautious expressions of people not quite sure what they'd signed up for. One looked nervous, the other just tired. They asked to do a courtesy inspection of the barn, citing a vague neighborhood concern. I greeted them with coffee and calm. Then I showed them everything of the registration, the federal documentation, the historic exemption zoning, the insurance coverage, and the preservation initiative papers. I even offered a guided walk-around. One of the officials turned out to be a veteran. He asked if he could take a picture with the tank. I said yes. 10 minutes later, they left smiling, a little amused, and clearly unimpressed with whoever had wasted their time. But the real moment came after they were gone. Not 30 minutes had passed before Karen strutted by my fence with her phone raised, pretending to film a harmless vlog. It was obvious she was trying to provoke a reaction. She didn't get one. That night, I started getting messages from neighbors I hadn't spoken to in weeks. Karen had apparently gone door to door, warning people that I was housing unstable equipment and might be planning to roll it out during a future home meeting. She even hosted a backyard event titled Keeping Our Streets Safe, complete with Roz A. copyright, scare tactics, and a slideshow. According to one of the guests who quietly filmed the whole thing and sent it to me, Karen told dramatic stories about the psychological harm caused by combat vehicles in suburban spaces and declared, "We can't live in harmony with symbols of warfare parked in our front yards." She went on to accuse me of emotional instability and claimed I'd once threatened to crush a neighbor's car with the tank. That was it. I compiled her statements into a transcript, attached it to my legal documentation, and sent the whole packet to the local newspaper's opinion desk. I included a note that asked a simple question: at what point does neighborhood authority become neighborhood harassment? I didn't expect much, but the article was published the next day, online and in print. The headline read, "Veteran Targeted by HOA for Restoring Historic Military Vehicle." It was more balanced than I could have hoped for, and surprisingly, it even called Karen's yoga event a bizarre overreach in optics-driven leadership. Something shifted. Neighbors started approaching me again, offering quiet nods or compliments while walking their dogs. One guy even asked if he could sit inside the tank just once, for the bucket list. Karen, predictably, doubled down. Just after noon the next day, I heard shouting outside. The tone was unmistakable, fake urgency wrapped in performative concern. I peeked out the window and saw her once again in front of my gate, phone in one hand and the other flagging down a tow truck. She was in full meltdown mode, demanding the driver remove the tank. "This is dangerous," she screeched. "It's a violation of code and a threat to neighborhood children." The driver looked completely lost, like he'd just been dropped into the middle of a bizarre dream. I stepped outside just as he was snapping a photo of the tank and slowly backing away, clearly realizing he was not equipped either literally or legally to deal with a 52-ton piece of steel on private property. Karen spun toward me, voice trembling with a mix of frustration and righteous fury. "I'm not going to let this thing just sit here another day. It's monstrous. You don't even have the decency to care about community aesthetic." I calmly held up a phone already recording. "Say that again, please." She froze. Instantly, her tone softened into a clumsy smile. "Oh, I was just asking about your project. I think the community would love a tour." Then she turned and walked off just a little too fast. That's when I noticed it, a metallic glint in her hand, not her phone keys. Later that night, one of my motion-activated cameras caught her on the far side of the barn. The footage was grainy, but unmistakable. Karen, sneaking near the fence line, crouching, fumbling near the tank's side hatch, clearly looking for something unlikely: the ignition. Maybe she thought she could move it, or worse, sabotage it. Whatever she thought, it didn't matter. I had the footage, and I sent it straight to the county sheriff's office with a formal report. Tampering with historic military equipment or even decommissioning it was no small matter. It wasn't just trespassing, it was a federal offense. The next morning, Karen was nowhere to be seen. No bright pink windbreaker, no Lambo humming outside, no pacing monologue. The silence was, frankly, unnerving. I checked the whole group chat. It had erupted. One neighbor posted, "Why was our president trying to tow a resident's vehicle without a legal order?" Another added, "Didn't she say the tank was dangerous? Now she's sneaking onto his property?" Screenshots of the newspaper article made the rounds, alongside stills of her failed yoga event. Someone even posted a meme of her trying to ward off the tank with a handful of crystals, captioned, "Ho versus History, Final Boss Battle." That afternoon, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Evelyn, my elderly neighbor, polite and gentle, and absolutely the last person I expected to see holding political fire. "My husband was a tank mechanic in Vietnam," she said, smiling warmly. "He'd have loved what you've done with that beast." She handed me a folded envelope. Inside was a petition signed by 18 residents calling for Karen's removal as HOA president due to abuse of power and targeted harassment. Evelyn winked. "Thought you'd want to see it before the next meeting." I stood there stunned, paper in hand. The war was no longer mine alone. Karen had overplayed her hand and the neighborhood was starting to see it. And not because I had a tank, because I hadn't used it, not until it mattered. And that moment was nearly here. Saturday morning came with an eerie stillness, too quiet, too careful. I opened my front door to the hum of distant engines, murmured conversations, and more cars than usual lining the cul-de-sac. Folding chairs were being placed in rows in front of the community clubhouse. The emergency home meeting called in response to the petition was underway. I hadn't planned to attend. My role, I thought, had already been played, but something told me this wasn't a morning to stay inside. When I arrived at the edge of the crowd, the gathering had doubled in size. Karen stood at the front, framed by her inner circle, dressed immaculately in white. She was smiling, but her jaw was clenched just a little too tight. Her eye twitched in that barely noticeable way people only catch when they're losing control. She hadn't expected this kind of turnout, especially not this kind of crowd. Signs were scattered through the audience. One read, "We want peace, not power." Another held a screenshot of her tank towing attempt. Who's really the threat? Karen cleared her throat and launched into a prepared speech. She spoke about safety, visual harmony, and protecting the character of the community. She framed her actions as necessary interventions, blamed recent aggressive energy for her behavior. Carefully, she never named me, but every sentence bent in my direction like heat seeking a target. That's when I stepped forward. No words, no grand entrance, just calm, deliberate movement. People made space. Quiet fell. I stopped 10 feet from the stage and stood still. Then, behind me, came the unmistakable low growl of a diesel engine. Karen squinted into the sun. The tank appeared at the end of the road, crawling forward at a respectful, snail's pace, gleaming, silent, steady. It wasn't charging. It wasn't threatening. It was arriving. My friend Carlos was behind the controls, licensed, cautious, fully legal. He parked it neatly at the edge of my property, engine idling like a distant storm. I didn't need to say anything. Karen's expression said it all. The crowd turned phones up, heads turning from her to me, from spectacle to symbol. Karen tried to push on. She raised her arms and called out, "Let's remember, today is about peace, not provocation." But it was too late. The spell was broken, and for the first time, she wasn't directing the scene. Carlos crept the tank to a perfect stop at the edge of the property. Draped across the front was a bold vinyl banner, "Historical Artifact A, proudly protected, fully legal." It was equal parts defiance and documentation. The crowd didn't recoil. They cheered. Laughter rippled through the cul-de-sac. Phones came out. Shutters clicked. Karen's weaponized narrative turning me into some kind of backyard warlord collapsed right there on the asphalt. The very thing she'd painted as a threat had become a crowd pleaser. a symbol of legal rebellion wrapped in steel. She tried shouting something about fire codes or safety violations, but her words got swallowed by applause. She looked to her clipboard cronies for backup, but they just stared at their shoes, unsure whether to measure a lawn or flee the scene. And then came the checkmate. A woman in a tailored navy blazer stepped onto the makeshift host stage and requested the mic. Calm, professional, and holding a stack of papers like they were legal dynamite. "My name is Sarah Miles," she said, representing the county oversight board. That quieted even the birds. She explained that her presence was prompted by a sudden spike in resident complaints. Then she read from a prepared statement, a clear, unflinching, surgical. Karen Blakely, it turned out, had committed a laundry list of violations: a misuse of HOA funds, a unauthorized installation of surveillance equipment, a fraudulent zoning map alterations, a false filings with forged notations, a attempts to annex property without owner consent. Every line was a nail in the administrative coffin. Karen tried to cut in a half a gasp, half a protest, but the legal rep silenced her with a raised hand. "As of this morning," she said, "you are suspended pending formal review. All HOA actions under the altered boundaries are void. You no longer represent this community in any legal or administrative capacity." Karen's mouth opened at a broken bar, then shut. The crowd just watched, silent. No one clapped, no one booed. It was quieter than judgment. She stepped off the stage like someone walking into the ocean. She was sinking into the grass with every unsure step. Her entourage peeled off in different directions like ducks sensing danger. And then it was done. The tank sat idle, its engine cooled. The street, for the first time in weeks, felt still. Someone handed me the mic. I hadn't planned a speech, so I didn't give one. I just said, I never wanted a fight. I just wanted my driveway back. That was enough. For the next hour, people came by and not to gawk, but to talk. They asked about the tank, shared horror stories. Several walked with me back toward the barn just to shake my hand, not because I'd humiliated Karen, but because I'd held the line, and reminded them that nonsense, no matter how shiny or loud, falls apart in the face of facts and patience. Later, after the last of the folding chairs were collected and the banners stuffed into trash bags, I returned to the porch. Waiting on the steps was a small basket. Inside, a toy Lamborghini, a plastic tank, a bottle of decent wine, and a handwritten note. "Next time, just run it over." No signature, just quiet humor from someone who finally understood what we'd all been tolerating. I stood there for a long while, sipping a little wine, letting the tank catch the last slant of sunset. It didn't look like a weapon. It looked like a boundary marker, a reminder, a 52-ton period at the end of a very long sentence. In the weeks that followed, things changed. Karen formally resigned. The HOA board restructured entirely. Evelyn that Evelyn, sweet with a spine of steel, was elected as the new president. Her first actions: a ban all HOA activities within 20 feet of non-member property, a reissue the bylaws in plain English, bullet-pointed and bolded, and install a community suggestion box that wasn't bolted shut. As for me, the following Monday, I got a call from Atlas Defense Systems. The hiring manager had read the article, seen the footage. He didn't even ask for an interview. He just said, "If you can navigate a suburban war zone, you can handle our operations team." Life settled. Not normal exactly, but stable. On weekends, I started hosting workshops. Local kids came by to learn engineering basics. A few veterans dropped in to share stories, and the tank became part museum, part landmark, part very well-behaved pet. I never drove over the Lamborghini, didn't need to, because sometimes, knowing you could is louder than actually doing it. And as for Karen, her greatest fear was never destruction, it was irrelevance. And now, finally, quietly, permanently as she was,